So what I'm going to be talking about tonight is phonology and morphology. We're going to go through some examples, and I'm very hands-on teacher usually, so, but I also want to make this very real. So this is a, not a lot of, theory. It's more of, thinking about things in practice. So half of, I would say actually all of everything I've learned in practice. I did not have training as a reading teacher before I was thrown into being a reading teacher. So a lot of this stuff has evolved over time. But over the last, 20, 6 odd years, however long it's been, I've changed a lot, and I've changed my philosophy a lot, and I have grown as an educator, and I've admitted I'm wrong more than 257,000 times, I would guess. So it's always good to learn and to grow, and I'm going to share a little bit of that with you tonight, some of the things that I've learned along the way. So now I'm going to hopefully share my screen. All right. So the reason I called this Best Friends is that you should always, in my opinion, have these two things together as you're teaching. And I am not talking about advanced language. I'm talking about from the very beginning. And initially, I was raised whole language. That's, I was a natural reader. I didn't even realize that I was a natural reader until I tried to teach kids to read. And I realized that when I said sound out words, I had no idea what I was talking about. So I just knew them, and I didn't have any idea why my students didn't know them. So over time, I figured out better ways of teaching kids, and I'm continuously doing that. I'm still changing things that I do and trying to make it better. So as we go through this, there's a big push right now, for the science of reading. And everyone's saying, we need to follow the science of reading. We need to follow the science of reading. And I wanted to try to bring people back to what the actual word science means. Okay, SCI means to know, and ENCE makes it a noun. So it is basically, you go to science class, you're going to know class. You want to learn how things work. It is a branch of knowledge or study that deals with a body of facts systematically arranged to show the operation of general laws gained through observation and experimentation. So if you are truly, invested in the science of reading, then you have to be a scientist when you are looking at the way that you're teaching children. So it is not a bandwagon to jump on. Science is continuously evolving, and we have to evolve with it. And so a lot of the things that we know about reading, they're new. Reading has not been a science for very long. And it's not really been in practice for very long that we've taught every child how to read. We had never been expected to teach all children how to read. When I was a child, you had a vocational track, and if you weren't doing great academically, they pushed you into vocational trades, right? So then if you were in 10, 20 years before me, they just had you drop out. And 100 years before that, you only needed enough of a skill to, do basic reading, writing, and arithmetic, and, work on the farm. And before that, we're talking most, of the population was not literate. So we actually had illiteracy laws up until 1865. It was mandated that certain groups were not allowed to learn how to read. Minorities, freed slaves, and some places women. So, and now we have to, in that short span of time, we have to learn how to teach everybody and how to teach everybody all together. And that means it is a new science. And since it's a new science, we need to be open to change, and we need to be open to improvement. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the words in the science of reading. And these are those PH words. It's phonological awareness, which is your ability to hear and manipulate sounds in oral language. We know that has a huge predictive, value for kids when they come in if they don't have good phonological awareness, that they're, you know, going to struggle, and that we're possibly going to need to give them, you know, extra phonological awareness instruction. Phonemic is, means it has to do with a single sound. So at that phoneme level, at that individual level. So when people say phonemic awareness, they're talking about that individual sound. Phonological awareness is more all-encompassing. Phonetics is the study of speech sounds. Phonology is how those sounds interact with one another, including sound meaning. And some people's definition doesn't include sound meaning, some does, but it's really about the sounds in a particular language, and sounds in languages vary, and the way that we manipulate those sounds vary depending on the language. So it is an entire unit of study. And then phonics, which in its most basic definition is taking a sound and pairing it with a symbol. You know, so, you know, one day someone said, gosh, I'd really like to remember these stories we're talking about. Maybe we could figure out a way to write them down. So then, you know, the written word was born, because we wanted to be able to hold on to knowledge and tradition and things like that. So these at a smaller level, we have a morpheme, which is that smallest unit, that single meaning, the phoneme, that smallest unit of sound, and then a grapheme, which is that single sound spelling. So it can be composed of one letter or two letters or three letters, but it's at that sound level. So if I hear a sound, how am I going to take that sound and represent it with letters? And those are important to know because we are always in reading instruction talking about these three categories. So when we talk about a morphological continuum, and morphology is that study of meaning and understanding meaning, and it goes hand in hand with phonology and oral language. And so I've done a presentation on this before. So if you want to look at, you know, a previous presentation that's on our YouTube channel, you can look at advanced phonemic awareness, because that's where I took the next, or this slide, and a couple of the previous slides, because I'm going to kind of build on that concept. But we have a phonological continuum, that is that rhyme, sentence segmentation, syllables, you know, listening for the sounds within words, and that phonemic awareness. And this rhyme kind of picks up where school starts, right? And when school starts, that's when we really are talking about this instruction. But language starts way before that. It starts from the minute you're born. A baby is trying to communicate with its parents for, you know, food, right? Or they're tired. There's actually like a whole study of babies' cries, which is phonology, sound, and morphology. There, what that means, right? So, and if there are parents on here, you kind of learn the cry. You know, that's a hungry cry. That's a tired cry. That's a hurt cry. And that is putting that morphology, that meaning, with that sound. So this is something that starts from the very, very beginning. And we, you know, on that meaning continuum, we have kids will start adding suffixes and substituting words and adding and removing syllables, you know, kind of understanding at depth that like a sound level meaning, like if you had, you know, sweep and swept. So what is that at the end going to sound like, or mean, as far as meaning is concerned? And that morphemic awareness is about manipulating those. And then you've got this kind of, you know, these continuums overlap one another, and they really shouldn't be taught in isolation. They should be taught together so that the kids are going to get maximum benefit. We do a lot of things in education that I think are kind of counterproductive when we say we're going to do just phonological awareness, just vocabulary, you know, just phonics. And we break those up throughout the day instead of learning how to integrate them all together, so that we have a better base for, you know, which to grow on and move forward as we're learning language. So the first thing is, I think we need to ask ourselves some questions. So am I a reading scientist, right? Am I just jumping on somebody's bandwagon? I'm going to follow what everybody is already saying. Then you're not really a scientist. You know, you are a follower, and we need more scientists in the classroom, because the classroom is where we are doing our experimentation. The classroom is where we are seeing what's working, what's not working. It's where we need to, you know, practice, what we're talking about, that we need to say, this is not working, and is there a better way, and am I open to those possibilities? So if you are truly a reading scientist, then I think you should be able to answer these questions. So are you thinking about the reasons you're using a certain strategy, right? Am I using this strategy because it is in the best interest of my children, and it is actually targeting their deficit areas or their areas of need? So when I do something, is there a reason behind it, right? I've had teachers where, they'll say, they put Happy Thanksgiving on the board, and then they tell the kids to make as many words as they can out of Happy Thanksgiving. And I'll say, well, what are you doing this for? And they're like, so they can make a bunch of new words. And I'll say, well, how do you make a new word? You can't, if you don't know it and you're in second grade, how are you going to create a new word? You might be able to rearrange them into words you already know, but that means that your intent for the lesson is not being actualized. So, after further discussion with the teacher, she goes, fine. It's the day before Thanksgiving and half the class isn't here, so we're just making as many words as we can at a Happy Thanksgiving. And that made me feel a lot better, because you're wasting time, you're wasting time, and then at least those things are aligned. So that means it's more likely that when you do something on a regular day, that it is well thought out. So is your teaching in alignment with current research, right? So are you looking at what you're doing and saying, is this aligned with current research? So look at what is out there, look at the research that is out there, analyze it, try it out, make sure that what you're doing, hasn't been disproven 30 years ago. Some people are still, clinging to something that has been dead for quite a while. So you don't want to be one of those people, right? You don't want to be in the history books, the person that wouldn't let go of a bad strategy. So are you open to challenging your current belief structures? So, like I'm on, some Facebook groups that I'm sure a lot of you are on, and, somebody throws out something that somebody doesn't currently believe, and it becomes like a personal attack. A good scientist is not attacked personally by somebody questioning their methodology. I have never had a problem with people asking me questions about why I am doing something. If I can't answer why I am doing something, then maybe I haven't thought it through well enough. I have parents all the time questioning me about how do you teach? And, why do you do that next? And how long is it going to take before you know that my child is progressing? And what are you going to do if they're not progressing? And what assessments are you going to use? And how often are you going to assess? I could care less if somebody grills me like that, because I should, as a professional, be able to answer those questions. And if I can't answer them, I should be alarmed and I should go figure it out, right? So I actually like when people ask me those questions, because it, makes me feel like, okay, I am thinking about what I'm doing, and I am, making progress with the students that I'm working with. And sometimes I go back and say, why am I doing that? And I think that is what a good scientist does, right? They're not emotionally invested in their curriculum. They're not emotionally invested in the way that they're teaching. It's not about you as a teacher. It is about the students. And so scientists, if they find, that they have been doing it wrong, a good scientist will say, we found out we were doing it wrong. I can't, how many hypotheses have been disproven by a scientist that thought they were going to be able to prove it? I mean, it's, they're closer to the answer because they have disproven something that they thought was going to happen. And that's the way we should look at this. So are you asking yourself the why behind what you're teaching? So not just the reasons for using a strategy, but why am I doing it this way? Why am I not seeing the results I want? Why am I not looking for other ways to do this? And asking the kids to be able to understand why. Because when you understand it, and when kids understand it, they're going to be way more invested in doing something. Because if you don't understand the reason, then people are less likely to jump on board and believe that what you're doing is right. So make sure that you understand it so that you can talk to your kids and give them the answers they need. And then your confidence will increase as well. So the other thing is that when we're talking about the why, you know, if you know it, do your kids know it? Do your students know it? Okay, we don't need to teach ourselves. We need to teach them. We need them to do a lot of the answering. We should be asking them a lot of those questions. Right? And be open to questioning your methods when students aren't making progress. I think that in education, we have a, I would say it's a culture or a habit or a, I don't know what it really is, a bad practice of blaming the parents or blaming the kids or blaming the curriculum or blaming the lack of pencils or whatever it is that we feel is contributing to our students' lack of success. When the reality is we're the ones that are in the room with those kids. Are we doing the best job that we can do in the time that we have with those students? I'm not saying that parents aren't a contributing factor. I'm not saying that, you know, school funding is not a contributing factor. There are a lot of factors, but are we doing the best that we can in that time and not displacing you know, our frustration onto, you know, the people who aren't the reasons. The parents aren't the reasons. Our job is to teach reading. And if we can't do that, are we taking responsibility for that? And I think that that's super important. And I think that's what good scientists do, right? So we're going to talk about some of the science and some of the reasons behind things, but I'm going to talk about first like a traditional phonics approach. So phonics is not a bad word, right? You know, it's just, all it is that a sound paired with a symbol. But some of the ways that we wield phonics may not be the most efficient ways. So when there are letter first approaches, there are some issues that I have with that, but we're going to talk about what it means first. So a letter first approach would be, this is, you know, the letter B. B says, you know, B, ball, B, right? A, apple, A. We tell them the name of the letter, we tell them a keyword, and then we tell them the sound. Okay, so this is a more artificial way of starting that reading process, but something that they're unfamiliar with, but then we give them the keyword and then we give them the sound. We give them alternate spellings and sounds in isolation. So instead of, you know, explaining, you know, where those things come from, so like can be spelled, you know, with an F, with two Fs, with a PH, and the kids have to memorize all the alternate spellings of that sound. Or they can do the alternate sounds of that letter. So they'll say, oh, an A, but it can also say, you know, it can say A, but it could say it could say some other things, but I'm just putting three up there. They introduce letters based on the shape. Well, you know, that is a visual shape memorization strategy. And, you know, I'm going to explain why that's not the best thing, but introducing letters based on frequency, which I call the Wheel of Fortune model. We don't speak based on frequency of words or sounds and words. Introducing sounds as either one letter or two letters or three letters. Like, you know, we have to wait to teach ch because it's two letters, and we need to teach all the one letter, you know, sounds first, and then we'll go to the three letters, and then we'll get up to four letters, like A as in sleigh. Or working through phonics, then spelling rules, and then waiting to work on vocabulary until we get to the upper grades. I think that there are some problems with this methodology, and these are some of the problems that I see. So when we do that letter first, like that letter, sound of the week, letter of the week, there are 26 letters. We could get through letter of the week, but there are 44 sounds. If we don't talk about those sounds and do, you know, sit and teach all of those, then we're never going to get to ch or sh or right? Or, you know, ooh and ow, and a lot of these, you know, sounds that we have that are not in our 26 letter alphabet. So we want to make sure that we hit all 44 sounds, and letter of the week is not going to cut it. This type of approach has a really high level of cognitive burden. Okay, that means it's rote memorization. They have to remember a lot of things. Most of our struggling readers have memory deficits. So if you have a background in reading psychological reports, you'll notice that almost every learning disability, there will be some type of memory deficit. It's very likely that they're going to have short-term auditory working memory. Sometimes it's a long-term memory transfer. But what happens with this approach is that with enough repetition, and the phonics isn't wrong, but with enough repetition, then it'll get in there. But what if you could do it in a more efficient way? That's what I'm talking about. So this also has primarily visual anchors. Here's the shape of the letter. Look at this. Look at this letter. This is what the sound is. Here's a picture of a ball, and this is the b. But I just taught you a, apple, a, and now I'm teaching you, b, b, or b, ball, b. And when I taught you apple, I said a, said a, but in ball, there's an a, and it says ah. So that is a little bit confusing if a kid is paying attention, which mostly they aren't, but they're subliminally catching on that this is not making any sense. We just spent a whole bunch of time on you telling me it's ah. The very next week, you're telling me this is b, but then the very next letter after it is an a, and it doesn't say ah. So we are giving kids these mixed messages and making them have to memorize based on the initial sound in the word. We don't learn language based on the shape, frequency, or number of letter sounds. We don't. We learn language by the people around us. We learn it by, our parents talking to us, by us babbling, by, having that serve and return in a rich language environment. We don't, we didn't walk around and say, oh, in our head, this is a B, I will call it B. Language forms the opposite way. So our parents don't say, I'm going to teach them all the round sounds first, all these, letters that are round. We develop our sounds based on, an articulation model. So certain sounds are going to start first, and then they'll build that way. And that's the way babies start to babble. That's the way they start to talk. And then they start to learn through repetition and practice and morphology. Okay, we'll talk about that. So vocabulary building and gap bridging for a lot of those kids that come in with really large gaps in their vocabulary, we can't wait to teach them how to read and how to spell and then start working on vocabulary, because we've lost a lot of time. And we will, if we've been working with that morphology the whole time, then their vocabulary will have exploded by the time we start giving them this rote memorization of like Greek or Latin roots. So this is my opinion, and I'm hoping that you guys are all being reading scientists and stopping and thinking. If you are feeling defensive right now, if you're feeling like, oh my gosh, this is the way that I do it, then you're not a reading scientist. You have to listen and absorb. You may not agree, right? But it shouldn't be emotional. It should be thoughtful. So hopefully, as we continue through, you'll maybe see what I'm talking about. So a phonological and morphological approach is sound and meaning first. So it's not letter first. So you would say the sound, you would feel the articulation points in your mouth, and you would pair that with the spelling. So with, b, your lips pop when you're going b, 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 and we want to make sure we say it correctly. We don't go b, but it's like b. So your lips pop. It's actually a bilabial stop, because two being bi, labia being lips, and then the air stops, but the b is voice. So you can feel the vibration, right? So after you've gotten, your students to feel what they already know, because they have been saying the b sound for a very long time, those stops, those especially, the bilabial stops are some of the first sounds that kids are saying. So those b, t, d, that's why they say dad, dad, right? Before they say mommy, which upsets every mom. But those are developed first, and kids are very familiar with them. So if you can anchor to something they already know, which we know we're supposed to do, activate that prior knowledge, and then we're giving them that way of feeling it, then they're going to have an easier time anchoring to what that letter looks like. Okay. So alternate spellings of sounds are taught with the meaning. If we're going to teach that can be spelled as a PH, why on earth would we not tell them the Greek roots, that have PH in it? Because if we are telling them that they're going to see a PH and they're going to have to read words with a PH in it, then that means they are going to be reading words with these Greek roots in them. So if you're asking them to read the word phone or telephone, why are you not teaching them that PHON is sound, right? That is going to give them the meaning behind the word that you're asking them to be able to read, because you wouldn't teach them PH if you weren't expecting them to read words with PH. So why not add that extra meaning in so that you're not losing that opportunity? So if we just do it from a phonics approach, then we're teaching them just that spelling and not the meaning to be paired with it. And these are just a few examples. So I put, like, you know, the sound and then writing and then fear, because most kids know phobia and they know autograph, and they will see these. And so if they see a PH, it is a cue, a morphological cue, that there's a meaning right there ready for them to be able to figure out, so they can figure out what those words mean. And then if they know autograph, then later they can read their Psyche and find out they have graphomotor difficulties, right? So they can take that piece and transfer it to new learning. And that's really what we want. We don't want them to just visually be able to recognize PH, and when they see PH to say, that's just a component part. We want them to understand what they're reading. And if we can build those two together, then that makes more sense. So if you're teaching PH in isolation, maybe you should stop and say, why am I doing that? What words am I really expecting them to be able to understand and read? Most people are confused by, you know, a lot of the PH words in the reading, in the science of reading, because they don't really know what the roots are. So if they don't know what the roots are, then all those PHs get confusing. So the alternate spellings of sound should be taught with that reason, the reason for it. So the language of origin, which would be like your etymology, the history of that word and that spelling or that meaning. The preservation of sound. So in phonics, there are times when the reason that you have certain spellings is because you want the sound to stay that way. And so you can't, you know, you have to have a double letter. You want to be, you know, hoping, you know, versus hopping, or vice versa. So you're going to have to preserve that sound. So phonics is definitely a component of this, but it should not be the primary component. Because if phonics is the primary component, what that means is that you are decoding, but you're not understanding what you're reading. And that's not what our goal is. Our whole goal for our readers is for them to find joy in books, not to memorize phonics rules. So we want them to find the meaning. We want them to find language interesting. We want them to be able to have some anchors other than visual, auditory anchors, right? So when we use this approach, here are some of the benefits. There are 44 sounds and only 26 letters. So if you're doing a sound first approach and you were teaching those bilabial stops, you would be teaching b is the quiet one and b is the loud one, and you'd be able to feel the difference. And that means you can teach two at once. You can have them look in the mirror, they can feel it. You talk about their tongue placement. You talk about, you know, whether they feel, whether it vibrates or not. You talk about words that have that sound in it. You have them brainstorm words. You have them auditorily recognize those. There's lots of things you can do to make it an oral motor kinesthetic strategy. And we know that there are thousands of nerve endings in your mouth. And we're taking advantage of those nerve endings in your mouth to anchor that information to that sound and symbol correspondence, right? That phoneme to that grapheme. If we're doing it through that oral motor kinesthetic and explaining to them what is actually taking place, they can already say b, right? Most kids can say b. It's very easy. It's developmentally one of the first sounds. So if they can say it and they know a bunch of words with that sound in it, we can pair to what they already know. We can activate that prior knowledge, and then we can activate all these, you know, nerve endings in your mouth and feel exactly what is happening. And that's going to lower that cognitive burden for kids. It's not pure rote memorization that needs extra repetition, because we've gotten that information in there in a more efficient way, right? And if you just have the ball strategy where you have a picture of a ball and you have it on the wall, I mean, there is research that says pairing a letter with a picture will increase a student's ability to retain that sound, right? But that research is done between not having a picture and having a picture. That research is not done from this angle. So we might have the science that says a picture is better than not having a picture, but what if this is better, right? If you have a picture, you have to stop and you have to say, okay, I see the letter, then you have to think ball, then you have to segment the B off of it and then say B. And that is a very labor intensive process where you can have it overlearned and already have those neural pathways directly to the mapping of that by using your mouth. And I'm telling you, there are different wall charts in different classrooms all over the place. And if you have a picture cue, then what happens is the kids are anchored to that, but when they leave and go to another room, it's not going to be there. I'm telling you this, they leave the room, their mouth goes with them. They come to school, their mouth comes with them, because I've asked them to leave their mouths at home and it's never happened. So some of them, I'm like, did you leave your mouth at home? Right? So it's just a way of using the resources that you have to help kids to anchor to it better. And then your wall could be a sound wall. You can have p, b, t, d, ch, j, k, g, all of those sounds that are going to pop. Then I call them poppers in that category. And then the kids will have that on the wall. When you start teaching alternate spellings, you'll teach the first spelling, and then you can start teaching alternate spellings, and they would go on the sound wall, right? When you get to your vowels, then you would teach oral motor kinesthetic, so like e, o, and they would feel that, go through like the vowel valley. If you are familiar, Louisa Moats, so speech to print, read it forever ago. Her third version has come out. I have not gotten it yet, but I'm really dying to get it. So if you have not purchased it, every reading teacher should have that on their bookshelf. And if you're familiar with speech and language and articulation points and linguistics, all of this stuff goes together. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about that phonology and that morphology mixed with phonological and morphological, right? Because they kind of like are slightly different, but they will achieve the same thing if we're using them all the time. So teaching from a sound first perspective and putting morphology in with your instruction builds on that language acquisition already in place. Kids are learning they're like little computers. They're using morphemes. They're saying big and bigger. And, I always say, when people say kids can't do morphemes, I'm telling you, when a 2-year-old says cookies to their mom and their mom gives them one cookie, that kid knows the difference between that z at the end, right? Because they said cookies. They didn't say cookie. And then they're flopping around on the ground because they're mad about it. But they're not going to say, obviously you missed that morpheme at the end of the word cookie that indicates that it is a plural request that I was making and not a singular, right? But they do understand morphemes at a very deep level, even at that age. So we can build on top of that because kids are smart. They really are. We don't give them enough credit because sometimes we're uncomfortable with learning new different strategies. Language acquisition is primarily auditory or oral. Every time I say oral, people think I'm saying oral, so I say auditory. When you're, learning all of this language, you're going to, use your ears. And so why not take that and use that as our starting point for blending that with that visual, orthography, that visual system of spelling, and start from there first. This sound first works for typical kids, your dyslexic kids, your English language learners, and this works for deaf children as well, because how do you teach them to figure out what sounds that people are making? It's going to be, through mouth position, through, lip reading. It's also going to be from feeling the difference in the vibration. So this method works for everyone. When people say, oh, everything doesn't work for everyone, I don't believe that. Okay, I think it works for everyone. And do I think that I'm constantly still improving the way that I do it? Absolutely. But this approach, whereas when you have a letter first approach, kids with poor memories and poor phonological awareness tend to be left behind. And so if we have a method that is going to benefit everybody and give them all better vocabularies, then I think that is a great idea. I love the number of questions that I'm getting, which means I'm getting some people who are a little like, so I love that. As long as you're being nice to me. That's all right. So the vocabulary building and gap bridging needs to start immediately. Most of my background is in schools. So I've done a lot of private tutoring, have a tutoring center. I've had a tutoring center for a very long time, but I train a lot of public school teachers. I work with a lot of schools. I have a personal affinity for low income and struggling kids and second language learners. And so if I'm going to teach second language learners to read, we say that alphabet knowledge is the biggest predictor of success. You come into school and you know your letters, that is the biggest predictor. Well, when I'm teaching all these kids who've come from China and Latin America, and who knows where they're coming from, they don't know a number of letters, but I'm able to get them how to teach them to read. So we have to stop looking at things as they are the end all be all. Why don't we say knowing the number of letters in the alphabet it's predictive, but why is it predictive? It's predictive because it's about exposure, right? Have those kids been able to learn it because they have good memories? That's predictive. The prerequisite skills are predictive. They've gone to preschool. They have parents who've read to them. They have had the magnets of the alphabet on their refrigerator since they were born, right? They're read to every night. All of those things tend to correlate. But does that predict the number of letters? Then why can I take kids who only speak Chinese and teach them how to read? Why can I take kids adopted from Russia and teach them how to read? How can I take all of these ELL, schools that I work with large Spanish-speaking populations, and how do I teach them how to read in English? It's because if you understand phonology and you understand that some sounds are in some languages and some sounds aren't in other languages, and then you teach kids how to feel those sounds, you take the burden off their memory, right? And you make up for that gap that maybe kids who don't have exposure, who don't have parents who read to them, or don't have English as a first language, you're able to start bridging that gap immediately, and mixing in the morphology is going to build that vocabulary immediately. So this way, you're really, and this is my daughter when she was young, she didn't kill me. I say this most trainings. When she was young, she said to me, "Mom, if we do this and this at the same time, we'll stone 2 birds to death," right? What she meant was, we'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And what she taught me there is that you can take the same exact, meaning, and just that word order is going to completely change it, right? And so we know that because that's semantics. But what it made me realize is that when I'm teaching these kids, I am stoning birds to death, okay? I am saying, I'm going to do this a slightly different way, and I'm going to make it more effective, right? Other people might be killing 2 birds with 1 stone, but, I'm stoning them to death. So I still use that expression, which usually catches people off guard, but it's a family thing. I also say gooder all the time because I have a daughter who kept saying worser, and they're now 22, so I'm sure they love these stories. She would say worser, and I would say worser's not a word. And so she finally got really mad at me, and she said, "Fine, what's a gooder word to use?" And I was like, oh my gosh. And so I still say gooder. But that's also, just my kids. All right. So this also will easily teach the sounds that violate that acrophonic principle. And so the acrophonic principle is that it's harder to teach letters that don't have the sound as the initial sound in the name of that letter. So if you're saying this is B and B starts with B, the theory is that if you're doing B, ball, it's going to be easier if those letter names follow the acrophonic principle, which means, B, B, P versus the F, right? You hear F, like kids have trouble with L, like elephant. They think that in elephant, L is 1 sound, but it's really F-O. That's that acrophonic principle. And you can bypass the acrophonic. The problem with the acrophonic principle in our language if you teach sound first, because they know, okay, you don't have to worry about whether the name of the letter is a problem, because once they have got the mouth movement and they know and they hear and they can watch your mouth doing, then you can show them the letter F. Names of letters are the least important thing. And this might be earth-shattering, but I knew my daughter was dyslexic very early. And so when she went to preschool, I skipped over letter names. I just said, I showed her an S and I said, this is, right? I showed her a P and I said, this is, and that's how she learned. She didn't know her letter names, but her preschool teacher was mortified. She would say, oh my gosh, I'm so worried about her. When I show her an S, she says, and I said, well, isn't that the sound? She goes, I know, but she's not saying the letter name. And I'm like, well, why does she need to know the letter name? Is that more important than the sound? But the reality is you don't need letter names very often, but you do need the sounds, and you need to be able to say, visually pair that sound with that symbol for sure. But how often are you required to spell out loud? Not very, right? And I've taught a lot of adult illiterates. They all know their ABCs, right? But they can't read. So what are we missing that 30% of our 8th graders are proficient on the national, on the NAEP study, right? 30%, that's it. We've got to start looking at the science of reading and start doing things a little bit differently, okay? Sound, spelling, and meaning can be taught simultaneously with depth of knowledge built over time. If you're going to teach sounds like sh, zh, are a voice and unvoiced pair, right? Sh, zh. And when you have those two sounds and you're teaching that in kindergarten, and you'll say, well, you hear zh, like treasure, right? Television, and they start to recognize that that sound is in our language. Then as you start teaching those spellings, you can start saying, well, zh can be spelled T-I, right? Or it could be spelled S-I, and we're going to talk about when and where we would do that. So now we've got that sound of zh, and we'll start teaching them, not, the beginning of kindergarten, but we'll start teaching them how to build on top of that sound knowledge so that they can then do Russia and Asia, because we're going to find that at that juncture of those roots or base words and suffixes, we're going to get a lot of sh and zh, right? So we need to know those. We can't just skip over that. So this nation, I was teaching my wordplay class today. Nation was one of the words we did, so I just stuck this in here. So our syllables are nation, right? So when we hear nation, most people would say, okay, how many syllables do you have? They are nation, right? We have 2. And then when we have phonemes, we have n, a, sh, n. Those are the sounds, individual sounds we hear. The graphemes, which are our letters, I have a mistake here, so ignore that. But it would be N-A, right? N and then an A. T-I should be one sound, sh, and then O and N, okay? Morphemes, so N-A-T means to be born, right, or birth, and then I-O-N is going to be that noun suffix that's at the end. So even though nation is the way we would pronounce it, and that's more of our phonology, the morphology is going to break at the T and then the I-O-N, because T-I-O-N is not a suffix, okay? A lot of us have been taught that it's a suffix, but if it's a suffix in nation, then that means N-A is the root, and it's not. So we have to start teaching kids, what really exists. So this is, just a word matrix on, to be born, right? So you've got nature, natural, nationality, neonatal, international, right? We've got a bunch of words that we can make if we know what NAT means. And then there are a lot of words that kindergartners would know, first graders, second graders. We don't have to wait to do this until kids are in high school. It shouldn't be a last ditch effort to help them with the SATs. So I am just wrapping it up right on time. If you would please follow us on YouTube at Kendore Syllables and on Instagram and Facebook. I would love that. My daughter's actually starting to become impressed. I have some followers on Instagram. It's hard to impress 22-year-olds. And this is what we do. So we are a reading center. So we do online we're accredited orton-gillingham. And we do teacher training. We're accredited by IDA, the International Dyslexia Institution, or Association. I'm past president. I should be able to say it. And IMSLEC. And now we're going to go to our questions. I feel like I just talked a mile a minute. I'm going to take a drink. It's iced tea, even though it says on my glass, it says, shh, almost, now you may speak, because it's really a wine glass, but I'm drinking tea. Okay, Catherine, did you get some questions?
Yeah. First of all, I owe a big apology to all of you who woke up early and put on your woolly sweaters down in Australia and New Zealand. We had some people say, it's not a summer evening here, it's a winter morning. So thank you for getting up early and bundling up for today. We appreciate you. Okay. Sorry, I thought it was queued up and then I kind of went back to top again. And the first 99 comments were, we can hear Catherine.
I know. There's going to be hundreds of those.
Okay.
Like so Jennifer, I'm waiting for the comments where Jennifer is an idiot for not turning her volume.
No, somebody said, we're glad you're human. So that's good. Yes, we will be recording
so
this.
Human.
This webinar will be recorded. So you will be getting a link to that soon. Okay, this is from Kimberly. The questioning of my beliefs go along with my recent reading of David Kilpatrick's book when he says the letters QU should be pronounced like coo, as in cuckoo clock. I'm still mulling that over. Your opinion on the QU sound?
My opinion is that QU makes two sounds most commonly, and that would be the k and w. So if you had quit, it would be it, and quiet, so it'd be queen, eaten, queen. So QU is a consonant blend that sounds like a KW. And so it doesn't say coo, in my opinion. That maybe that's dialectical. So, but yeah, that's my opinion on that one.
Okay. When introducing letter sounds, would you use the magic C letters or how would you group them?
The magic C letters.
Yeah, I don't know what that means, but I thought you probably would.
I think that is exactly what I was saying not to do, to be honest. So if there's so many names for things, but I'm going to assume that was when you're talking about the ones that start as the C and then you make it a D and then so that you start with letter shape. I do it from letter sound. So I would say I would do your stops, which are that p, b, t, d. Those are voiced and unvoiced. I do it from sound first. When kids have letter confusions based on what they look like B and D, if your students had like a good solid anchor on where their mouth positions are, then they wouldn't need to worry about B's and D's as much. Because most kids, they walk around, they say my mom and dad, they don't walk around saying my mom and bab, right? So it's just a confusion about pairing it. They look at it, it's confusing, but if they could feel it and they go, my mom and dad, and if they had a clear pairing between that symbol and their mouth formation, then I think that they would have a lot less confusion that way. But I could be wrong about what magic C letters are, but that's what I am assuming they are.
That makes sense, okay. Okay, in our OG and SNS, we do offer frequency of sound spelling as a way of eliminating certain spellings based on frequency. That seems useful. And then they say, can you explain your Wheel of Fortune model, which I think might be putting two different things together, but.
Yeah, so a lot of curriculum out there, what they do is they say, we're gonna do M and S and what you would pick for Wheel of Fortune, right? The letters, not sound spelling frequency. So I completely agree with what you're saying. So if I'm gonna teach, a way to spell the A sound, then I'll probably do open syllable, excuse me, open syllable A, right? It's going to be the most frequent spelling. Open syllable E is going to be the most frequent spelling. I'm not going to pick, some really random spellings of these, like teach E, I, and IE, like I before E, except after C, right? I'm not going to pick field, IE, if I want to teach the E sound first. I would do that last. Because you're right, you'll get the most bang for your buck by teaching frequency of those sound spellings. What I'm saying is don't pick letters by their frequency. right? If you wait to teach other letters because they're not frequent, kids, they always are speaking all 44 sounds all the time, right? And that's what I'm saying, is that you can't not teach all 44 sounds. You may not teach all spellings of all the 44 sounds at once, and you have to prioritize so you don't overwhelm their poor little brains, but you can be making it easier on them by pairing it with, you know, mouth movement, with meaning. You know, I'm a big fan of teaching, you know, when teaching consonant blends, teach what those blends mean. When you're teaching pH, teach the whole root. When you know, there's when you're, you know, talking about the sounds of Y, talk about when, where, and why you're going to hear the E sound, you know, and the I sound and the I sound, and so that's what I'm talking about, is when you hear these sounds, and then you can go back and forth between, you know, teaching those alternate spellings and morphology, and because that's why I use nation. In order to break nation down to read it, there's a lot you have to know there, right? You have to know open syllables. You have to know what happens when that T is followed by an ION, that's going to say that shun sound, nation, right? And most of the time it sounds a little like shin, not shun, but what happens is that if you don't know that NAT is the root and you think the root is based on the syllable, then you're going to miss out on the entire meaning. So we don't want to just confuse phonics, you know, for meaning. We want to make sure that we're giving kids all the tools that we have to be able to get them to be able to understand. Because like if they have station, they're going to hear stay, but stat is the root, you know, and on and on and on. I could go on and on and on. It's going to be the same thing with like expulsion, PULS, right? To push is the root. So that's why you have an ION at the end, and that's why it's SION. So you don't have to memorize whether it's a TION or an SION. If you know what the root is, if you hear that sound, it should be paired with a meaning, and then it should be paired with, you know, the philosophy behind, you know, roots. So yeah.
I know you've kind of addressed this, but it came up again, so I'll ask. What grade level are you referring to for phonological and morphological approach?
K through 12. And since I'm 50, K through 47-ish years, I keep learning all the time. I keep learning, and I learn, you know, something new literally every day. And now that I'm 50, I forget stuff too. So I get to relearn it, and I'm just as happy when I learn it the second time. So in kindergarten, you can easily talk to kids about morphemes. You can easily, if you're going to teach them right? ER, you can say teacher, a smarter teacher, a faster runner. And those are morphemes. That's a suffix and that's a unit of meaning, and it can be oral. And you can talk about, you know, one of my favorite examples is helicopter and pterodactyl. The PTER in helicopter means the same thing as the PTER in pterodactyl. You can show them that our words actually make sense because, you know, helicopter is spiral flyer, PTER means, you know, to fly. And then pterodactyl is flying finger, so like tactile, dactyl. And kids can see those relationships, and then you've now defined two words that they knew already, but now you gave them something to anchor that knowledge to. So if they ever see those spellings again, like a pteropod in science, they're going to be like, oh, that means fly. And then hopefully they learn pod means foot. And then they start to, you know, have that morphological awareness, you know, and apply it to different words. And that's really what we're hoping kids develop. That's our main goal, is that they start to develop a vocabulary and take that information and apply it to new experiences. They can feel it in their mouth, right? They can hear it. The mouth movements help you to spell because it's anchored to the symbol, and the symbol, you know, is going to anchor to the mouth movements. It's going to help you to read and decode. The meaning is going to, it all can come together to, you know, be like an orchestra, because our language is an orchestra. It's not just, you know, the oboe. You know, it's going to be all these things together. And we don't want it to be like a third grade orchestra. We want it to be like a Philharmonic.
Good analogy. Okay, how do you represent sounds on a sound wall?
Okay, so I use what I call, because I have my own curriculum. So I have balloons, and my balloons are my popping sounds. And then I have the leaking sounds, and then I have another leaky balloon for that. And then I have I have a story that goes along with the curriculum. So there's a mnemonic and things happen, and that story helps kids to anchor to some of the concepts as well, because most kids have good context-based memory. They can remember like where they were at and what it looked like, and they have good visualization and memories of stories. Most kids, not all, but most kids. And so it's another, anchor based in brain research to give them that kind of mnemonic to go along with it. And then I use the vowel valley, which is, pretty standard. It's the vowel circle, language circle. That's what I was saying. If you look in Louisa Moat's book that I was referencing, if you look at what Linda Mood Bell has done, and they've been around since the 60s. If you look at just any, I have linguistics books that I just bought. They were like educational linguistics books that I bought on my own that were textbooks from classes. And look at the fact that that's what's going to happen with our mouth positions. I mean, your dentist doesn't say open up and say E. Your dentist says open up and say ah, right? Because, you can't get anywhere with E. You can't get in there. And so we know that when you go like this, ah, you're going to have an open sound, and ooh is going to look like this. So we're just learning to play our instrument. And, when you just do letter first, you're just teaching kids to read notes. You're not teaching them that where the air goes out of the hole of the oboe, right? And so to me, this is just more comprehensive. So on my sound walls, I use what we call our poppers or leakers, our neighbors, our vowel valley. Then we do blends on the wall. Then we do the sounds that don't have their own spelling. So I have different sound walls, and then I would sort them by whatever concept that was teaching right there. So if I'm doing the vowel valley, I have words on there that are going to be sorted by the vowel sound. So if I'm doing ooh, then underneath it would be food, right? So if I'm doing it, underneath it would be hit, or whatever words we're focusing on. I'm not going to be putting them in alphabetical order, right? And I don't put words when I do my initial sounds in isolation, when I'm doing the voiced and unvoiced sounds, because I haven't gotten to words yet. And I don't have even picture cues, because if you can feel it, you have enough input there to be able to retrieve it. And with enough, practice that's multisensory, kids can retrieve that. I don't use picture cues for consonants. Most of you probably have experienced this. If a kid comes across a word they don't know, like, it's purple, they'll go pickle, pineapple, pumpkin, potato. They say the first consonant sound. They're pretty good at consonant sounds. They're pretty crisp, they're pretty clear, they're easy to articulate. They're the first ones that they started saying when they were babies. So why do I need a picture cue when I've already taught the mouth position? It's like that, it's easy. Vowel sounds are different because, it's more confusing, auditorily confusing, depending on where you live. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and sometimes that it's bad everywhere, but it's really bad here. And then depending on where you live, there's different dialect. Depending on different, cultural groups, you're going to have different dialect. And you need to say, this is standard American English, but where we live, we tend to say pin and pen the same, right? Those are things that you're going to have to point out. If you have kids with African American vernacular dialect, you're going to say, this is what you're saying. This is what standard American English is. But this is the thing, is that no matter what the dialect is, dialect is never bad, right? And you don't ever act like it's bad, because that's the way their mom talks. That's the way their grandma talks. It's a product of their culture, and their culture should be respected. But we have a standard called Standard American English, so that everybody knows what everything, kind of is. It's generally accepted. So if you want to be a sportscaster and you say milk with like 3 syllables, then you're going to have to learn to say milk with 1 syllable so that you can speak to everyone in the country, right? And so that's Standard American English. People who speak Standard American English are no better than any other dialect, no better than any other accent in any other part of the world. And so it's really about, in like a lot of the kids that I work with, it's called, it's code switching. They talk to their friends in their vernacular, and then they talk to me differently, with their parents differently. And that, most kids are pretty adept at that if they have either a second language or they have a very strong vernacular. But you have to understand that they are going to have extra cognitive burden because they are constantly switching, right? If you've ever gone somewhere where you can't understand what people are saying because their accent is so thick, at the end of the day, your head is like, that hurts, right? Because you are switching, you are trying to figure out exactly what's going on. So all of those things, I think, kind of come together on your sound wall where, you know, I've had people look at my sound wall and say, well, that's not the way I would do it. And I was like, well, that's fine. As long as you justify why you're supposed to be doing it, why you put it where you put it, and your kids say it that way. Because I'll have teachers who say, WH says, what? Like, when? And I'm like, do you say when or do you say when? Because I'm pretty sure I just heard you say when, and all your students say when, where, and what. So why are you teaching it as when those don't match? So you want to make sure that you have, you know, a deeper understanding of that. So.
Okay. A lot of people ask to say the name of Louisa Moates' book again. So that is Speech to Print by Louisa Moates.
Louisa Moates. There's a brand new 3rd edition out, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm sure it's, you know, even brillianter.
It's gooder.
It's gooder.
Okay, if this approach is all auditory, what about those students who have hearing impairments and auditory processing disorders? I have students who need visuals and cannot process things as easily.
I'm sorry, they have what? I cut you off.
I have students who need visuals and cannot process things as easily when they just listen.
Okay, so just listening is not what I'm saying. I'm talking about feeling. So if you're just listening, your auditory system, like, it disappears, right? You know, you hear something and someone would have to repeat it for it to be back. So, but if you have anchored it to your mouth movement and you have, you know, some way of holding on to it, then you don't need to have a picture cue. People who say their kids need picture cues have never tried teaching them without picture cues using their mouth. And that's what I found. So if people are open to trying it, I think they're going to find that they need a lot less repetition to get kids to that point. But also when you talk about their mouth position and you talk about the way you feel it, you know, right? That F and V, hard to hear, but you can feel the difference between that, right? Then when you want to spell something with that sound and you've anchored to that, you know, then that makes it easier because you have all this, you know, tactile, kinesthetic way of holding on to it. And you don't have to stop, because, you know, those kids who go like this, they go, okay, that's an F, and then they go, because they're thinking of the word they were taught to go with it. They're stopping, they're trying to pull it apart, they're thinking of it in isolation, and then they say it. By the time they get to the end of that word, it's going to be like they forgot the beginning, right? They have to have automatic retrieval and overlearned neural pathways. They shouldn't have to stop to translate from a picture, because that's what you're doing. You're saying a picture is another language, and you're saying, here's a letter, here's a picture, now use this to translate to the sound. And that puts another step in between that we can eliminate a lot of the times. And learning 44 sounds, almost anybody can do it, you know? So it's only 44 things. Kindergartners can learn all 44. There's no reason why they can't. They can say, I want a chip. They can learn ch, right? They know how to say it. And so they can learn how to make that grapheme. So. All
right, I'm going to combine 2 questions here. One says, can the OG, direct, systematic, explicit approach marry with your approach? And the next question says, can you speak to where structured word inquiry fits into your recommendations?
Okay, so I am a huge fan of phonology and morphology. Okay, so I am Orton-Gillingham accredited. Okay, so I went through that whole process, lengthy, yes it was, okay. But what Orton-Gillingham really means is that it is a structured, systematic, multisensory, cognitive, like you've got to hit all these things, right? Well, I teach in a very structured, sequential, systematic, multisensory, cognitive, right, way. And that is what ticks all the boxes. Right? So my order of introduction may be different than a typical, like a lot, and I say typical because OG varies wildly. And so you can have, like, the older OG will be based on the shape, right? Because back in the 50s, we thought, you know, it was a visual issue, and it was called word blindness. And it was like, you needed more visual repetition. And so starting with certain shapes was going to make it easier for you because of your visual system. But you know, and some of those people, they've added phonological awareness, and it still works because it's not wrong, right? But could it be more efficient? And I am always looking for more efficient because I work, you know, in the schools where I get very little time to train, way less time than I would ever want. And I have not enough time for repetition to get teachers to where I want them to be. You know, a lot of times, you know, a lot of teachers continue on and they'll come and want to go through certification and things like that. But a lot of teachers, they're just, you know, trying to struggle to teach all day. They've got 6 different subjects they have to teach. They have, you know, kids with behaviors and different IEPs and all, you know, being a teacher is not for the faint of heart, right? And I have a huge respect for public school teachers. And I do sometimes get a little annoyed with teachers who only have one-on-one. Of course, you can do a better job one-on-one. You know, like you've got one, it's really your behavior management. It shouldn't be a problem. So, you know, when I do what I do and what I've, you know, worked through is that, you know, when I first started working, I was at a inner city school in Atlanta for quite a while. And I taught mostly phonics in those lower grades, mostly phonics. And these kids, I wanted them up and reading as fast as I could. And I was like, gonna just, you know, but I tested these kids from kindergarten. It was a K-8 school. And I tested them all the way through, even if I wasn't working with them. I wanted to see what kind of progression we had going. And over the first few years, what I noticed as soon as they got to 2nd grade, their decoding of nonsense words and their decoding was phenomenal. But they didn't know what words were. So even though they were decoding them, you know, nonsense words, they did great. Real words, they would say hysterical, which technically is phonetic, right? They broke it down when one of the possible options, but they didn't recognize that it was wrong. So, you know, there are different types of errors, right? Like if I had kids that were, you know, reading wounded as wondered, they're just making it into a picture and they're guessing. You know, I'd rather they go wounded, right? That would be better because at least I know they're, you know, but they don't recognize that that's wrong. And when they weren't, you know, accenting the right syllable, they didn't know these words. So they were like, they would look at me and they would go, miser, misser, and hope that I would tell them which one was right. And that meant that they were trying it all the ways that I taught them, but they didn't pick up on the meaning. So I noticed really quickly because my initial teaching experience was high school. I was a high school behavior disorder and learning disabilities teacher. So when I started working with these lower grades, I was like, I need to do what my high school kids needed, which is teach them how to actually read, right? That meat. And then because I had like 6 months until they were graduating or whatever was happening, I had to get it done fast. And then when I started working with the younger kids, I realized, okay, we're doing all the things we're supposed to do, the read alouds, all those fun things and getting oral language and vocabulary. But there was a missing piece because their phonics was great. I mean, great. I had some like kindergartners that were reading it, you know, when you do that grade equivalent, it's like 16.9, like they're 6 years old, they're doing 16.9 grade level. That just means that they can apply the code better than the majority of the population, not that they understood any of the words. And I realized I've got to add more to this. Even in kindergarten, these kids, the gap is so wide. If I don't start now, I'm in trouble. So that's when I started shifting to, you know, putting in the morphological pieces from the very beginning, from showing them the patterns in words, from showing them what things mean, you know, that WR means to twist, you know, and then I started, you know, learning more about what blends mean and, you know, talking to them about Greek and Latin roots, even though I wasn't holding them accountable to spelling them necessarily. I put helicopter and pterodactyl up on the board and I would say, look, these parts mean the same thing and they both fly. So I was setting the stage for this is what's coming. And I would say, can you think of other things that fly? Can you think of, you know, other words that have this, you know, base word? And we would talk about them and expand that vocabulary so that they were better able to recognize these when they came across them. And so that was my biggest epiphany. And then I saw the numbers change dramatically over those years. The kids that, you know, were in 2nd grade 3 years prior now, it was different. And then I started teaching morphology to the 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th and 7th grade because there's still so much more that you can learn as you're going through. We should not stop teaching how to read in 2nd grade. It should be like math. We can keep going. There's more to learn. There's more opportunity. So sorry, I'm very passionate about that one.
We started a little late, so are you okay going a little bit longer?
I'm fine. We still have quite a few people on. So as soon as like people start dropping, I'll stop talking, or if I run out.
You might be here all night or all day for you Australia people. What can we expect to learn if we take the wordplay workshop?
This is what I teach. So if you are like seriously advanced and you already know everything that I've said, you might think it's a little bit basic for you. But if most of what I've said about, you know, morphology and the sound first model and whatever is new to you, then you probably will learn a ton. So it's, you know, it's about marrying, you know, basic sound level morphology with phonics instruction. So a lot of the SWI folks, which I looked at the names of people registered on this class, so I know that some of you are like having a meltdown right now, but not just the SWI people, but some other people, some of you I know well. But I figured, hey, you know, it's a pandemic. Nobody can come get me. We're quarantined. I'll cool off by the time this is over. But the thing is that, you know, I think that we can marry those two together. I think that there can be a little bit more on there's a huge learning curve for the teachers that are in the classroom right now. And if we went strict SWI, I think there's too much to know to get started. We have to, you know, move teachers into this and get them excited about it and change the way people are thinking about this, because when you bully teachers, they're going to dig in. So if they don't know it, and you're saying, well, you should know this, and you're making them feel bad for the job that they're doing, that's not fair and it's not nice, and they're not going to want to do it. So you need to have a model where you can transition over time to, because they don't have endless amount of hours to study all of this after they've done school. And now that we're doing virtual, so when I do wordplay, I blend them. It's a curriculum, and you can use it as a curriculum if you want to, or you could just use it as materials if you want to use it with something you already have. So it's designed that it can be pulled apart and done piecemeal. Because when I first designed it, the teachers, I tried to tell them shun wasn't a suffix, and she said yes. This one teacher said yes, it is. And I said, well, look at this, act, and then ION. See how act is the root? And then I did station, and then I did like 40 other words. And I kept going, which I should have just stopped and given up, but I wanted her to see it. And then finally I said, so does that make sense? And she said, well, I hate to say this, but no, it really doesn't. And I was like, well, what reasoning? And she goes, well, I have a poster that says it's a suffix. And so she had a poster in her classroom that said it was a suffix. So all the proof in the world was not going to change her mind. I had to, you know, and I was bullying her by trying to force her to change her mind. I had to slowly, you know, slow drip, get her to find that this was helpful and interesting and good for her students. And in the end, she was my biggest supporter for changing the way that they were doing vocabulary instruction, from memorizing 20 random words a week, you know, to having a more in-depth knowledge. But, you know, I wish that just saying it is so made people do it. Then we wouldn't have anyone speeding. We wouldn't have anyone not wearing their seatbelt. We wouldn't have anyone not wearing masks. We wouldn't have anyone not doing anything that's beneficial to everybody else. But that's not the way the human brain works. So I approach it a little bit differently. I love the people that are on the far end that are like purists, because they make me look more reasonable. And that helps me out a lot.
Okay, so when teaching, do you disagree then with teaching nonsense words if you say we should teach meaning along with sound and spelling?
I don't disagree with using nonsense words as assessment. I think they're valuable. So if you have, there are a lot of kids that are very smart that can fool you into thinking that they know how to read because they have great vocabularies and they can figure stuff out, but then they bottom out and they don't reach their potential because they really actually can't decode. They are just memorizing words. So I think that the use of nonsense words shows us that kids can actually attack a word they've never seen before and break it down and read it. And that weeds out the kids that are flying under the radar that may be fooling us with their sight word memory, with their, higher cognitive skills and all of that. So to me, it is a great way to assess that. Should all your instruction be in nonsense words? No. But when I teach older kids, like high school kids, I teach a lot of nonsense words. They have so many words memorized that I need to train their brain to actually look for the patterns and break them down and send it to that phonological processing center that's over here instead of memorizing them as whole words over here. So I'll tend to use more nonsense words with my older kids just to reprogram them. And then when I start putting real words in, they go, that looks familiar. And then all of a sudden I can do more of the morphology. But I just try to find the ways I can to circumvent some of the bad habits. But no, I'm not anti them, but your nonsense words should follow a pattern. Like you shouldn't just make random weird ZLRQAD or something. That would be weird. So they should follow, they may not mean anything, but also if you hate nonsense words or you think they're bad, there are so many words that are real that the kids don't know that you can use. So when I had my middle schoolers were rebelling against nonsense words, I made a list of words that were real that followed the patterns we were doing. And they're like, I hate nonsense words. I'm like, well, all of these are real. And they were like, what? And that was great because I learned some new words. I didn't know that mizzle was a word. So I knew drizzle and I knew mist, but I didn't know mizzle was a drizzly mist.
Really?
So I've never used it, but I learned that when I looked for words that were, based on the phonetic properties we were working on, that I wanted to make sure that they could apply them. So you can do that. So there's lots of ways to stone birds to death.
Okay, lots of people are telling us Magic C is a handwriting without tears thing.
Okay, I can tell you that. So handwriting without tears, I don't think it's terrible. I just think teaching sound first makes more sense. So if I were going to learn Arabic and they were telling me, we're only going to do the swirly ones first, but you're not teaching me the sound that goes with it, that doesn't make any sense to me. So, an OT wrote handwriting without tears. So an OT thinks that the hand motions are more important, right? But I don't know. I would love to hear what Ginger Behringer thinks about that. But, is it better to have that, to know the sound, and teach the sound with the symbol and then practice writing the symbol as you're learning that sound. So you can be saying B says B, and I know it's B because I can feel it in my mouth. So, I don't know. I've never done a back-to-back study on which one works better, but I like my way. I've done handwriting without tears. It's just, it didn't go with my scope and sequence, and then I was going out of order and the kids didn't learn those sounds at the same time. So I switched.
Okay, we're getting down to it here, but this one I think is really good. How can I help ensure that the etymology doesn't become an overwhelming cognitive burden for a kid already struggling with a cognitive burden? Is it mainly about pacing?
Okay, so, if kids have, the shorter their working memory, the more easily they're going to get overwhelmed, right? So if you teach this way and you can, if your memory is really, really small and you're going to need lots and lots of repetition and you teach this way, maybe you need 50 repetitions, right? Instead of 100. So that's the way I look at it. So, if your working memory is bigger, you might need 5 repetitions, by doing sound first instead of, 10 the other way. So I personally think we're always, doing it this way, that you lower the cognitive burden, even if you don't have cognitive burden, right? So if you've got a kid that can learn lots of things, why not let him learn lots of things faster? So it will relieve burden for everyone.
All right.
Okay, so I just saw one where it said, I understand what you're saying, but not sure if I agree that we should tell them all the sounds of each letter. We separate all long vowels alone, so learn the spelling rules one at a time. Okay, I never, ever once said that you should learn all the sounds of a letter at once. I said you should learn them sound first. Okay. Because they're saying they do one at a time. They might not do it all. I don't think you should learn anything all at once, right? But just so you know, whether you do it by long vowels alone or short vowels or whatever, I don't do it by long vowels. I would do it by property or what it says, or is it in some type of meaning? But I would never, ever tell them all the sounds of each letter at one time, ever. It would be, I would break it down, because my thing is you chunk it into small units and then you repeat it and you make sure there's mastery. Then you can add the next one. Sometimes you need 10 repetitions. Sometimes you need 25, and you're going to have as many different types of anchors as you can, mouth position or a story or a meaning that goes with it, or associating it with, all those phonological awareness activities. And you can do it with, vocabulary. So, but never, ever have I said we should tell them all the sounds of each letter at once.
Okay. All right. Do you want to glance through and see if there are any more you want to grab?
We still have like 700 people on here. Okay. So, let's see. Are there any of Kendore's resources specific to adult literacy learning? All of it. Okay. So, if you think of language as the same thing as math, if you can't read, you start from the beginning, right? If you can't do math, you start from the beginning. Even if you think they might know some beginning math, you review the beginning. I always start at the beginning, because if I'm talking to an adult about those voiced and unvoiced sounds, and I teach them that which is the example I used, our voiced and unvoiced sounds, then as I start saying, okay, vision, that sound, mission, right? That's that that's all over the place, that combination, especially when you have that base mixed with a suffix. So if I'm going to talk to an adult and have their vocabulary maximized, I want them to say, oh, I heard this word and I noticed that sound, and that means it probably has this suffix. And I'm going to be like, yeah, because you still have to have that base. You can't say, I'm going to teach math, but we're going to skip the numbers. I'm pretty sure you already know your numbers, but what if you don't? Go back, talk about why they're there, and sometimes, you have to go back to that whole philosophical concept. So I start at the beginning always. With kindergarten, it might take me a week to teach a concept. With a high school kid, it might take me an hour, right? And with a kindergartner, I'm just going to call it a lip popper. And with a high school kid, I'm going to call it a bilabial stop. And I'm going to tell them how, because this is what I used to do, is I used to say, okay, well, I'm going to do linguistics. If it's too hard for you, you just let me know. We're going to do a bilabial stop, and that means two, and your labia are your lips. And then, of course, they would laugh, but that was fine. And then I say, it's called a bilabial stop, but if it's easier for you, you can call it a lip popper. And they'd be like, oh yeah, lip popper. So I had them invested because they knew I wasn't giving them baby stuff, right? But then I took that and kept going and moved quickly, hopefully, to more complex and getting a more complex understanding. But they had a solid foundation that they could go back to. They knew all their sounds. You know how many kids don't know their sounds? They don't, or they were taught them incorrectly. And they don't know their R-controlled vowels. They still think A, E, I, O, U, and sometimes Y, which is not true, because there's lots of other vowel representations out there. Those are just letters. But if you have like the word light, IGH says I. Why don't we talk about that? But we create these ways of saying these things are exceptions or the things are different because of the way we phrase it. So if I were teaching geography, I would say I'm teaching North and South America. And if a kid said, well, what about Australia? I wouldn't say that's an exception. I'll say, oh, we'll get to that, right? So sometimes we say, here are the two continents, or here are the two sounds of A. Well, then what we've set ourselves up for is making everything else an exception, instead of saying, we're gonna study two of the continents, right? And then later we'll get to those other ones, so that we're not saying that those things are exceptions. We're not setting ourselves up for that. We're just saying we'll get to that, right? We're just going to work on these two now, and we'll get to that later. So sometimes it's just the way that we word things set us up for kids to be confused. So yeah, I start from the beginning with everybody.
Okay. Here's an interesting question, which I don't know that we can solve for, but teaching by sound requires students to see the teacher's mouth. How do you suggest going about this wearing a mask?
Okay, they make these cool masks where they have a window, and then you just have to put a little bit of dish soap on it, and that'll keep it from fogging up. And I know that because I like to scuba dive. Okay, so you can get those. I also saw this great video on this guy who took a Krispy Kreme box and turned it into a mask. You know the window on Krispy Kreme? He had it all right here, and then he cut it so that it went around his head, and it just kind of sat like a Burger King crown, but the mask was in front. I was like, well, that is pretty smart. But you can get them, and I would say it is imperative. It's imperative that they see your mouth. We actually use our mouths to hear. If anyone's ever heard of the McGurk effect, you know, your brain will look at somebody's mouth to figure out what they're saying. And sometimes if you can't see it, you can't hear what they're saying. And it's not that you can't hear, it's that you can't see. And because we use our eyes to help our hearing, it's imperative that the kids see your mouth. So if you can't invest in a mask with a panel, find a Krispy Kreme box. I would not recommend like a plastic bag over your head or anything, but I think the Krispy Kreme box, you can breathe.
All right. Well, should we leave it there at that?
Okay, it's all 500 people. Are there a ton more questions, or should I go to the end? Anyone who's still here that has a question, I'm starting from the bottom for a second, because I feel bad whenever I read these questions when I'm done, because then I didn't get to like 280,000 of them. So let me go down to the bottom and just see what we've got. Okay. Okay. Would anchoring the sound to a chant be helpful or hurtful? I don't like chants. I don't like music. It's maybe because I'm a terrible singer, but when you anchor language to music, in my opinion, because I can't prove this, I think that the music is what you remember and not the anchor. And the reason I believe this is because most kids can sing their ABCs, but they can't talk their ABCs. If I ask them what comes after M, they have to sing the whole ABCs, okay? The song is what they remember, not the content. If somebody turned on the radio, and I would be able to sing the words to probably 10,000 songs. But if somebody said, sing a song right now, without the music, nothing's coming out of my mouth. So maybe row, row, row your boat. Okay, so the music is the cue, and I don't want the music to be the cue. I want the knowledge to stay behind, and I don't think songs do that as well as people think they do. Okay, so that's my opinion on that. Sometimes these are my opinions based on my experience, which is not considered, you know, the gold standard in science, but I've tried it, and that's kind of where it goes. Okay. Do I recommend reteaching if an older student struggles but has learned letter name? Yeah, start from the beginning, tell them the sounds, talk about linguistics, tell them how to feel it. It's going to help them immensely, because then you can pair it. Because if you're saying like nation, if you're like, shh, you know, have you seen those ridiculous things where people say you can spell fish like Phyti, because TI can be sh? You can't do that. And the reason you can't do that is because a TI can't come at the end. That can only come at the, you know, at the juncture of a suffix and that root. So people think English is crazy because we don't teach it in a very logical, meaningful way for kids, right? And if we make it meaningful, they see the value in it. And a lot of times phonics, kids hate phonics. It's pure memorization and it seems boring. So you can make it so much more interesting if you can pair that meaning with it. Okay, so let me see what the next one is. What was the name of my YouTube channel? It's Kendore, Kendore. It is half of each of my daughter's middle names, Kendore and Catherine Kendall and Claire Dorian, who were named after two of my high school students. So kind of is like a full circle thing. And it's hard to find an original name. And my last name is Hasser, Hasser, which means to hate in German. So naming something the to hate reading program was not enough. Okay, can you buy your curriculum for morphology without taking the course? No, you can buy a ton of things about morphology. I don't do any of my training excel my curriculum without training. I feel that it is not nice to do that to teachers. So you can find tons of things on morphology out there, but I feel like teachers deserve training. They deserve to have the time to be able to learn this stuff. And schools ask me all the time, we would just want to buy it. And I'm like, no, because they won't understand it if they can't feel it, if they can't experience it the way a kid would. So I don't actually sell it without I mean, we have a lot of stuff we sell on our store, and there are things that you can kind of do in isolation. And there are some good games, like on our website, you can do like Caesar Pleaser and Soccer Teaser, and our Giants and Cyclops and Revlock. Those are all multisyllabic, and hard and soft CNG, which you need for those science words. And then Greek and Latin roots. I mean, those are great things that you can kind of do in isolation. But the actual curriculum, I don't sell individually. Let's see. Oh, I have one person that said, I agree. Okay. Oh, you never know.
There's a lot of agreement here on these comments.
Okay. Okay, so where do you suggest that I start? And I'll be honest, start, but with the questions the kids ask. People are like, this is so overwhelming. Where do I start? Just say, like, if they ask you a question, look it up. Let's Google it together. Let's get on dictionary.com. Let's look at what the roots are in there. Let's figure this out. I'll be honest, I've been training teachers for 20 years, and I'm teaching for 26 or 7, I don't know. But the thing is that I have learned more from kids or teachers asking me questions, because I go back and look it up, or we look it up together, and be comfortable not knowing. I mean, I cannot tell you how many things I do not know, and because I don't know them, or I tell you. That was kind of a stupid statement. But if you're open to learning, then you are into the science of reading. If you're open to telling your students, I don't know this, I'm just learning this, I thought this was super cool, they are going to be excited about it too. And they're never going to have a magical moment where, knowledge just pours into their head because they got their diploma and all of a sudden, I am all knowing. And they're going to be really, really sad if they expect that in life, because I'm still waiting for that moment. So just be open to it. I mean, I remember so many of the words that I really investigated with kids that shocked me, and it's funny because I didn't I knew the definition. Like, I knew pandemonium, and this is one of the ones I say all the time. I knew what pandemonium meant. My mom was always like, it's like pandemonium in here, because she had 3 kids that were a year apart from each other making a mess, right? It was loud, it was messy, and I knew that was pandemonium. I was able to use that word and transfer it to other things. But when I started doing this kind of stuff, I knew what pan meant, and I would talk about like panacea or pandemic or Pan-American Games. Is China going to be there? No, because it's all the Americas. And then pandemonium was on there, and I looked at pandemonium and I was like, oh my gosh, I just saw it in a completely different way, because it was like, basically my mom was saying all the demons had been let loose, like demon. Like, I looked at it and I was like, it means all hell is broken loose. My mom just called us all demons. Like, I looked at it differently. And and there are kids that are going to think it's, when a panda moans, so you have to say, like, what are these pieces and how do we pull it apart? Because I think it would be sad, and chaotic if pandas were moaning, but that's not what it means. So it's just about exploration and looking at it that way. Okay, so people are just basically saying thank you and all that fun stuff. So
and you may have missed a comment where someone said that she wants you to change your example to feeding 2 birds with 1 bird feeder.
It sounds less violent.
Maybe a little more humane.
It's going to be less impactful, because stoning 2 birds to death is the same thing as killing 2 birds with 1 stone, and so I'm not changing it, right? I have people like that all the time. I play a game called Hot Lava, and so when kids jump on the wrong word or morpheme or whatever, they burn a fiery, horrible death. Not really. It was an index card. They go to the end of the line. But I've had teachers say, well, I'm going to use lily pads. And I'm like, that's fine if you don't like lava. I mean, the kids aren't actually dying. and then I was like, wait a second, lily pads, won't they drown? Like, what's the difference? Like, which is worse? I don't know, but you know, do what's comfortable for you, do the process that's good for you, and then you can, you know, slowly learn and know that it's not going to all come in at once, and just accept that process, accept the process.
All right.
Okay. All right. I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I hope you guys all stay safe and in Australia warm, and have a great summer.